Know your place. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words landed anyway. Sharp, effortless, final, like a verdict already decided long before she ever walked to the table. For a fraction of a second, the room reacted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. A fork paused midair. A glass hovered just before touching someone's lips. A conversation, somewhere in the background, lost its rhythm and stumbled into silence. Then came the quiet murmur. Soft laughter, carefully contained, the kind people used when they wanted to belong to the right side of the moment. Table 12 had become a stage, and Emily Carter was standing right in the center of it. She didn't move. Her hand rested lightly against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed, posture straight. No flinch, no apology, no visible reaction at all. Under the warm chandelier light, her expression remained calm. Too calm for a room built on hierarchy and unspoken rules. Across from her, Daniel Whitmore barely noticed. Or maybe he noticed and simply didn't care. Men like him rarely needed to. His attention had already drifted back to his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly against the polished surface of his watch. A Swiss piece worth more than most people in the room earned in a year. Numbers moved across it, precise, controlled, obedient. His world was built on patterns like that. Predictable, measurable, owned. People were no different. Especially not waitresses. Especially not quiet ones. They always reacted the same way. They shrank. Or they snapped. Either way, they revealed themselves quickly. Efficiently. Like data points in a system he had mastered years ago. But this one did neither. Emily reached for the empty coffee cup sitting near the edge of the table. The movement was smooth. Controlled. Almost invisible if you weren't looking directly at it. She lifted it with steady precision, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the words spoken seconds ago carried no weight at all. And that was the first disruption. Because silence like that wasn't submission. It was something else. Something Daniel couldn't immediately categorize. Around them, the restaurant exhaled. Conversations resumed, though softer now, threaded with curiosity. A few glances drifted toward table 12, quick, subtle, then gone just as fast. People understood places like this. They understood the invisible lines. Who stood where? Who spoke? Who listened? Who mattered? And who didn't? Emily stood exactly where she was supposed to be. But somehow, she wasn't fitting into the space the way she should have. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. Now this was interesting. Not because of her. Because of the break in pattern. He watched her more closely this time, his gaze sharpening, curiosity replacing indifference. This wasn't about a waitress anymore. It was about a variable that hadn't behaved the way it was supposed to. He had built an empire by noticing those. Emily placed a fresh cup down in front of him. The porcelain touched the table with a soft, almost inaudible sound, easily swallowed by the low hum of the room. Her movements remained precise, efficient, refined through repetition, but not robotic. There was awareness in them. Intent. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Not in challenge. Not in submission. Something else. Something quieter. And far more unsettling. Daniel's fingers paused against his phone. Just for a second. A flicker passed through his expression, so subtle no one else would have seen it. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed control he carried everywhere. Because there was nothing remarkable about her. There shouldn't have been. And yet, as Emily turned to leave, her steps as quiet as before, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the people, but in the space between what Daniel expected and what he was starting to see. Like the first note of a song no one realized had begun playing. He didn't understand it yet, but the moment he told her to know her place, something about his own had already begun to move. The evening continued. Or at least, it appeared to. Glasses were refilled. Orders were placed. Laughter rose and fell in carefully measured tones. Everything looked exactly the same. But Daniel Whitmore found himself distracted. Not by noise. Not by conversation. By her. His attention drifted back to Emily again and again, despite every instinct telling him she was irrelevant to his evening. It irritated him slightly, that lack of control over his own focus. But irritation quickly gave way to something else. Observation. She moved through the restaurant with the same quiet precision, refilling glasses before they were empty, adjusting plates without interrupting conversation, listening without appearing to listen. At first glance, it was nothing. Just competence. But Daniel didn't build billion-dollar companies by trusting first glances. There was a pattern here. Subtle. Layered. Too deliberate to be accidental. He set his phone down. That alone was unusual. Across the room, two men in tailored suits were speaking in low voices. Business. Logistics. A delayed shipment. Numbers exchanged casually, like details that didn't matter to anyone outside their conversation. Emily passed by their table, and something changed. Her steps slowed, barely noticeable. Her hand tightened slightly around her notepad, then relaxed again. And she kept walking, as if nothing had happened. Daniel's eyes narrowed. There it was. A signal. Small, but real. He leaned forward slightly now, attention fully engaged. The room faded into the background as his mind began assembling pieces, connecting fragments, testing possibilities. An anomaly. And anomalies were never random. When Emily returned to his table, the atmosphere felt different. Quieter. Heavier. She placed the check folder down in front of him with the same composed movement as before. But this time, the silence between them carried weight. Daniel didn't reach for it. Instead, he looked at her. Really looked. As if seeing her for the first time. Not as a role. Not as a function. As something undefined. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise blurred into something distant, irrelevant. Then Emily tilted her head, just slightly, and spoke. Her voice was soft, steady, almost gentle, but every word landed with precision. She mentioned a number, a specific one, the same number from table 7, the delayed shipment. But that wasn't what made Daniel freeze. It was submission, but in restraint. Choosing. That was the unsettling part. She wasn't reacting. She was deciding. When you spend enough time listening, she said quietly, you begin to notice where things don't align. Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes stayed locked on her, dissecting every word, every tone, every possible layer beneath the surface. That's not an answer, he said. Still calm, but firmer now. A line drawn. The kind of tone that had ended negotiations, closed deals, and dismantled people who thought they could outmaneuver him. Emily didn't flinch. Sometimes, she continued, just as steady. Numbers appear in places people forget to look. A pause. Short. Measured. And conversations travel farther than they're meant to. Daniel leaned back slightly. Not retreating. Repositioning. His fingers tapped once against the edge of the table. A subtle tell. One that rarely surfaced unless something required recalibration. Because this wasn't normal. This wasn't a coincidence. This was access. And access, at that level, had consequences. You're implying, he said slowly, that you understood something before the people involved in it did. It wasn't a question. It was pressure disguised as logic. Emily said nothing. And somehow, that silence answered more than anything else could have. Around them, the room had shifted again. At table 7, one of the men glanced over, briefly, then again, longer this time. His companion followed the look, their conversation stalling mid-sentence. They didn't know what had been said, but they felt it. Something was off. Something was being seen that shouldn't be. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything now. And for the first time that evening, the dynamic he had controlled so effortlessly began to feel unstable. Not lost. Not yet. But no longer fixed. He leaned forward again, this time resting his elbows lightly against the table, closing the space between them. Not physically, but strategically. If you're guessing, he said, his voice dropping just slightly, then you're either very lucky, a beat, or very dangerous. The word hung there. Dangerous. Not loud, but heavy enough that even someone at the next table shifted subtly, sensing a change they couldn't define. Emily's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Not defensively, accurately. Or, she said softly, just paying attention. Daniel held her gaze. Longer this time. Testing. Pushing. Waiting for a crack. It didn't come. And that absence, that complete refusal to behave predictably, was beginning to do something far more disruptive than defiance ever could. It was forcing him to adjust. He reached for his phone again, unlocked it, pulled up the internal report. Numbers aligned exactly as he remembered. Timestamps confirmed it, updated less than 2 hours ago. After market close. After filings. After any logical access point had been sealed. His jaw tightened. Barely, but enough. When he looked back up at her, the shift was complete. No dismissal. No assumption. Only calculation. Let's assume, he said slowly, that you're not guessing. A pause. Then explain something to me. There it was. The challenge. Clean. Direct. Inescapable. The kind he gave to executives sitting across polished boardroom tables, not to a waitress standing under warm restaurant lighting. Emily didn't move, but her attention sharpened. If the discrepancy you mentioned is real, Daniel continued, what does it actually mean? Not the number, the implication, the structure beneath it. This wasn't a trap. This was a test. And the room felt it. At a nearby table, a woman stopped mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward them before quickly looking away. A server passing by slowed slightly, then corrected their pace. The air had changed. Something was happening. Emily took a breath. Not nervous. Measured. If the reported figures don't align with operational delays, she said carefully, then the issue isn't timing. Daniel didn't interrupt. Didn't move. It's structure, she continued. A beat. And if it's structural, it won't resolve itself before your meeting. The words were quiet, but each one landed with surgical precision. Daniel felt it. Not emotionally. Logically. Like pieces shifting into place faster than he expected. Which means, she added, investors won't ask about delays. A pause. They'll ask about transparency. Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that expands. That pulls everything into it. Because she wasn't speculating. She was right. Not partially. Not approximately. Exactly. Daniel exhaled slowly. And for a brief moment, something unfamiliar surfaced. Not doubt. Not uncertainty. Recognition. He had been building toward that conclusion. But she had already arrived. He leaned back again. But this time the movement wasn't about control. It was about distance. Perspective. Because the variable in front of him was no longer undefined. It was something far more complex. And far more valuable. What would you do, he asked. The question came without an edge. Without pressure. And that was the biggest shift of all. The room noticed it. Not consciously, but instinctively. The tension didn't disappear. It transformed. From dominance to attention. From control to engagement. Emily didn't answer immediately. Again. But this time, the pause felt different. Not defensive. Evaluative. As if she was measuring not just the situation, but him. If it were me, she said finally, I wouldn't wait. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Waiting turns a correction into a discovery, she continued. And once someone else finds it first, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. You lose control of the narrative, Daniel completed quietly. Emily nodded once. Small. Precise. The confirmation landed harder than any argument could have. Because it aligned. Perfectly. Daniel sat still for a moment. Then reached for his phone again. Not out of habit. Out of decision. He scrolled. Stopped. Hovered. Then locked the screen without doing anything. Not yet. Because something else had just become more important. He looked back at her. And for the first time that evening, there was no hierarchy in the space between them. Only clarity. You understand, he said slowly, that most people in your position, a pause, would have said nothing. It wasn't criticism. It was observation. Emily considered that. Briefly. Silence is easy, she replied. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't harden. But it carried something deeper now. Wait. Until something important is at stake. Daniel held that. Felt it settle. Because this wasn't about numbers anymore. It wasn't about data. It was about perception. Choice. Awareness. And the realization came quietly. That the person he had dismissed minutes ago had just stepped into a space he didn't offer easily. Relevance. Around them, the room continued its quiet performance. But now, people were watching. Not openly. Not directly. But the awareness had spread. Table 12 was no longer just another table. It was a moment. Unspoken. Undefined. But undeniable. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who controlled outcomes before they happened, was no longer entirely certain. He was the one leading it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, somewhere between certainty and doubt. And then suddenly, everything feels different. Daniel Whitmore felt it now. Not in the room. Not in the people watching from a distance. Inside. A calibration. The kind that only happens when a system, one you trust completely, encounters something it can't immediately process. Emily Carter was no longer an anomaly. She was a problem. Not because she disrupted anything, but because she understood something she shouldn't. And more importantly, she didn't need him to validate it. That was the first twist. Daniel reached for his phone again. This time, there was no hesitation. His thumb moved across the screen with precision, pulling up internal threads, encrypted updates, fragments of information that only a select circle could access. His world was built on speed, on acting before others could react. Control wasn't about knowing. It was about moving first. He scrolled through the report. Numbers, timestamps, revisions. Everything aligned with what he had already seen. Everything except one thing. The interpretation. He had seen the discrepancy. Of course he had. But he had categorized it differently. Contained it. Delayed it. Managed it. Emily had done none of that. She had seen it and immediately understood its consequence. Not later. Not after analysis. Instantly. That difference mattered. More than he liked to admit. He locked the screen. Placed the phone down. Shifted again. Subtle. But real. At a nearby table, one of the men from earlier leaned slightly toward his companion, whispering something under his breath. Their attention flickered back toward Daniel and Emily, no longer casual now. Curious. Cautious. Watching. Because something was happening. Something they couldn't fully hear, but could feel. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. And instead of ignoring it, he used it. He straightened slightly, adjusting his posture, not to reassert dominance, but to reset the frame. You're in a room, he said, his tone sharpening just enough, where information like that. A brief glance toward table 7. Moves markets. The pressure returned. Different this time. More precise. You don't just notice things like that, he continued. You act on them. A beat. So why didn't you? The question wasn't aggressive, but it was direct. It demanded alignment. Logic. Purpose. Emily held his gaze. Unshaken. Because not everything needs to be used, she said. Another pause. And not everything that can be turned into advantage should be. Silence. Not empty. Definitive. Daniel felt it settle. Deep. Because that wasn't naivety. That wasn't inexperience. That was restraint. And restraint was a form of power he rarely saw. The realization came slowly. But once it did, it changed everything. He had assumed she was outside the game. But she wasn't. She was choosing how to play it. And that choice put her on equal ground in a way nothing else could. Daniel exhaled quietly. The tension in his shoulders shifted, not disappearing, but redistributing into something more focused. You realize, he said, that people spend years trying to get into rooms like this. Emily didn't respond. You're already here, he added. A pause. And you're not even trying. This time, there was a flicker. Small. Almost invisible. But real. Not emotion. Recognition. Not of his words, but of what they implied. He was no longer testing her. He was acknowledging her. That was the second twist. And it didn't go unnoticed. The energy around table 12 changed again. More people were aware now. Not starting, but listening. In fragments. In tones. In silence. Because something had inverted. The billionaire was no longer leading the interaction. He was responding to it. And everyone could feel it. Emily glanced briefly toward the room. Not at anyone in particular, but at the space itself. Then back at him. This room, she said softly, isn't as important as you think. The words were calm, but they carried impact. Daniel didn't react immediately, didn't interrupt, didn't push back, because he understood what she meant. Not literally, structurally. Value wasn't tied to location, or status, or access. It was tied to perception, and she saw things differently. That difference was no longer subtle. It was defining the interaction now. Daniel leaned back again. But this time, there was no attempt to reclaim control. Only awareness. The kind that comes when you recognize a shift you can't reverse. You're not what I expected, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't criticism. It was truth. Emily nodded once. Small. Contained. Neither are you, she replied. And just like that, the final piece moved. The power didn't flip dramatically. It didn't collapse. It redistributed. Balanced. Quietly. Irreversibly. And for the first time that night, Daniel Whitmore wasn't analyzing the moment. He was inside it. Experiencing it. Adjusting to it. Which meant one thing. The game hadn't ended. But the rules were no longer his to define. The moment didn't break. It clarified. That was the difference. There was no dramatic silence. No sudden reaction that drew the room into spectacle. Everything around table 12 continued as before, glasses refilled, voices layered in soft conversation, the quiet rhythm of a place designed to feel controlled. But control was no longer what Daniel thought it was. He felt it now, not slipping, not collapsing, but shifting into something he couldn't dominate the way he always had. Emily hadn't raised her voice, hadn't challenged him, hadn't even tried to prove anything. And yet, she had already changed the direction of everything. That was the part that didn't sit easily. Daniel rested his hand lightly against the edge of the table, his fingers still for once, his posture no longer projecting dominance, but something else, something quieter. Awareness. He studied her again, not as a variable, not as a problem, as a pattern, because that was what this had become. A pattern he hadn't recognized at first. And now, it was becoming impossible to ignore. You didn't just hear that number, he said slowly. It wasn't a question. It was a reconstruction. You understood it. A pause. And you understood it fast. Emily didn't respond. But she didn't deny it either. That was enough. Daniel exhaled quietly, the realization beginning to settle deeper now, layering itself beneath everything that had happened over the past few minutes. This wasn't instinct. It wasn't luck. And it wasn't accessible. It was something else. Something far more precise. You've seen something like this before, he continued. Not pressure. Not accusation. Just alignment. Emily's gaze lifted slightly, meeting him for a brief moment. And this time, there was no restraint in it. Only clarity. Not exactly this, she said. Her voice remained soft. But there was weight behind it now. But patterns repeat. That word lingered. Patterns. Daniel felt it connect. Not just to the numbers, but to everything. Because that was the missing piece. He had been looking at the situation as a singular event. Isolated, contained, manageable. Emily hadn't. She had seen it as part of something larger. Something recurring. Something predictable. And that changed everything. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting for just a second, not away from her, but inward, recalibrating the structure he had built in his mind. You're not reacting to what you heard, he said. You're reacting to what it leads to. Emily nodded once. Small. Exact. And that confirmation landed harder than anything else. Because it meant she wasn't just ahead of the moment. She was ahead of the outcome. The room around them faded further now. Not physically, but in relevance. Because the conversation had moved beyond context, beyond position, into something far more precise. Understanding. Daniel's mind moved quickly, retracing the sequence. The number. The delay. The internal adjustment. The meeting is scheduled for the morning. He had seen each piece, individually, but he had not connected them the way she had. Not immediately. And that delay, even if it was small, had been enough. Enough for someone else to reach the conclusion first. That realization settled in quietly, without resistance, without denial. And with it came something far more unfamiliar than losing control. Respect. Not given lightly. Not assumed. Recognized. You weren't trying to correct me, he said after a moment. Another realization. Layering in. You were trying to prevent something. Emily didn't answer right away. But this time, the silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like an agreement. When people ignore patterns, she said finally, they repeat mistakes. Her tone didn't change, didn't sharpen, but the meaning carried through cleanly. And when they repeat them, she added, they don't see the problem until it's already visible to everyone else. Daniel felt that, not as criticism, as truth, because that was exactly what would have happened. He would have addressed it, eventually, at the right moment, with the right framing. But by then, it wouldn't have been his moment anymore. It would have belonged to the people asking the questions. And once that happened, the control he relied on wouldn't disappear, but it would shift, just enough, to matter. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling fully now. Not uncomfortable, just undeniable. And for the first time that evening, he saw the entire situation clearly. Not through the lens of strategy, not through the instinct to dominate, but through something simpler. Accuracy. Emily hadn't challenged him. She had corrected the trajectory, before it became visible, before it became irreversible. That was the twist. And it reframed everything. Daniel looked at her again. Really looked. Not searching. Not testing. Understanding. You weren't out of place, he said quietly. The words came without effort. Without hesitation. I was. The admission didn't carry weight the way it would have earlier. Because it wasn't about status anymore. It was about perception. And perception was the only thing that was wrong. Emily didn't react to the statement. She didn't accept it, didn't reject it. She simply let it exist, which, in itself, said enough. Around them, the room continued its quiet rhythm. But the tension that had once defined the space between them had transformed completely. There was no imbalance left, no hierarchy being asserted, only clarity. Daniel glanced briefly toward table 7 again. Their conversation had shifted. Lower, more cautious, less certain. And now he understood why. Because the moment they realized what they were actually dealing with, it would already be too late to control how it looked. Exactly as Emily had said. Exactly as he had not fully accounted for. Until now. He reached for his phone again. But this time, the movement wasn't reactive. It was intentional. Decided. Because the path forward was no longer unclear. It had been pointed out. Quietly. Precisely. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. He unlocked the screen, his thumb hovering for a brief moment before moving with certainty. No hesitation. No second-guessing. Because the correction needed to happen before the question ever formed. Before the narrative existed outside of his control. He placed the call. And when the line connected, his voice was steady. Not rushed. Not pressured. Just clear. Prepare a revised statement for the morning meeting, he said. A pause. Address the discrepancy directly. Structure. Timing. Full transparency. Another pause. No delays. He ended the call. Set the phone down. And for a moment, he didn't move. Because something had just changed. Not externally. Not visibly. But fundamentally. He hadn't just acted. He had adjusted. Based on someone else's perspective. And that was not something he did often. He looked back at Emily. And now, there was no distance left in the way he saw her. No assumption. No dismissal. Only recognition. You saw it first, he said. Not as a question. As fact. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment. Then answered simply. It was already there. And that was the final piece. Because she wasn't claiming insight. She wasn't elevating herself. She was stating something far more grounded. The truth had always existed. He just hadn't been looking at it the right way. Daniel leaned back slightly, the tension in his posture gone now, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance. Because the realization wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was useful, necessary, and most importantly, correct. The game hadn't changed, but his understanding of it had. And for the first time that night, he wasn't trying to regain control. He was aligning with what was already true. Daniel didn't move immediately after the call ended. The phone rested in his hand for a second longer than necessary before he placed it back down on the table. The sound it made was soft, barely audible, but in that moment, it felt definitive. A decision had been made. Not rushed. Not reactive. Aligned. Around them, the restaurant continued as it always had, unchanged on the surface. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed. Laughter rose in measured tones, controlled and curated like everything else in the room. But for Daniel, nothing felt the same. Because the control he had always relied on had just been redefined. Not lost. Refined. He leaned back slightly, his posture no longer projecting dominance, but something quieter, something more grounded. Clarity. Across from him, Emily stood exactly as she had before. Composed. Unshaken. Unaffected by the shift that had just taken place. And that, more than anything, held his attention. Most people would have stayed in the moment. Would have lingered. Would have tried to extend the conversation, to turn it into something more, an opportunity, an advantage, a step forward. But she hadn't. She had already stepped back into stillness. As if what had just happened was complete. Contained. Finished. Daniel looked at her, not searching now, not analyzing, just observing. You changed the outcome, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an acknowledgement meant to impress. It was simply accurate. Emily didn't respond immediately. Her gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but beyond the table, acknowledging the room, the people, the quiet structure of a world that operated on assumptions more than awareness. Not really, she said. Her voice remained soft. Steady. It was already going to happen. A pause. I just said it sooner. Daniel held that. Because that distinction was everything. Most people thought influence meant control. Shaping outcomes. Forcing direction. Dominating the result. But this was something else. Recognition. seeing clearly enough to act before the moment required it. And that kind of clarity couldn't be forced, couldn't be bought. It had to be understood. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a fraction of a second before returning to her. There are people, he said, who spend years trying to get into conversations like the one we just had. A pause, and they still wouldn't see what you saw. Emily didn't smile, didn't react the way most people would when confronted with recognition, because she wasn't holding on to it. I didn't need the conversation, she replied. I just needed to notice. Silence, but not empty, complete. Daniel let that settle, because for the first time that evening, the difference between them wasn't about position. It wasn't about status. It wasn't even about knowledge. It was about perspective. He glanced briefly toward the rest of the room. Everything looked the same. The same people, the same conversations, the same controlled environment built on perception and hierarchy. But now, he saw it differently. Not as a structure he controlled, but as a system of assumptions. And assumptions could be wrong. That realization didn't unsettle him. It sharpened him. He reached for the check folder again, opening it this time without distraction. His eyes scanned the total quickly before placing his card inside. The motion smooth, familiar, routine. But even that felt different now. Less automatic, more intentional. When he closed the folder, he didn't push it aside. He left it centered on the table. Finished. Then he stood. The movement was calm, measured, but it carried presence, different from before. Not louder, not heavier, just clearer. A few nearby glances shifted toward him again, subtle but noticeable. People recognized patterns, even when they didn't understand them. And something about this moment didn't follow the pattern they expected. Daniel adjusted his jacket, then paused. Not out of hesitation, out of choice. He turned, not toward the exit, but toward Emily. She had already begun to move, stepping back into the rhythm of her work, her attention returning to the next table, the next task, the next moment. As if this one had already passed. He stepped toward her. Not quickly, not with urgency, just deliberately. She noticed him approaching and stopped, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, waiting without expectation. There was no tension left between them, no imbalance, only space and understanding. Daniel looked at her for a moment, not as a businessman evaluating an opportunity, not as someone searching for advantage, but as someone acknowledging something real. There aren't many people, he said, his voice quieter now, who can walk into a room like this and change its direction without saying much. A pause, and without needing to. Emily listened, fully, but without absorbing the weight of the words, because she wasn't defined by them. When he finished, she gave a small nod. Nothing more. No reaction beyond acknowledgement. And that made the moment land even deeper. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. Simple, unembellished, no performance attached to it. He held it out toward her, not insistently, not as an offer that demanded acceptance. As an option. If you ever decide, he said, that you want to have conversations where this kind of perspective matters, a slight pause. There are places for that. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. Opportunity. Access. A different path. Emily looked at the card, then back at him. For a brief moment, something shifted. Not interest, not hesitation, consideration. Real. Measured. She understood what was being offered. And more importantly, what it represented. But when she spoke, her voice didn't change. Still calm. Still steady. Sometimes, she said, the most important conversations happen exactly where people don't expect them. A pause. And leaving doesn't always mean moving forward. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Not resistance. Not rejection. Just clarity. Daniel held her gaze. And for the first time that evening, he didn't try to reframe it. Didn't try to interpret it through his own structure. He accepted it. Because he understood. This wasn't about opportunity. It was about perspective. And she already had what most people spent years trying to find. He lowered his hand slowly, the card still between his fingers. No disappointment. No surprise. Just acknowledgement. Because the dynamic had fully shifted now. Not in dominance, but in understanding. He gave a small nod, then turned toward the exit. This time, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The lesson had already settled. Quietly. Completely. The door closed behind him with a soft sound, blending into the distant rhythm of the city outside. Inside, the restaurant continued. Unchanged. Or at least it appeared that way. Emily didn't watch him leave. Not because she hadn't noticed, but because she had already returned to what was in front of her. Her steps remained steady. Her movements are precise. Her presence, invisible again. To most. But not to those who had been paying attention. At table 7, the conversation had shifted. Lower. More cautious. As if something had been revealed without being spoken. A server nearby glanced at Emily briefly, then away, uncertain what had changed but aware that something had. And within moments, the rhythm of the room absorbed it. Like it always did. Outside, Daniel stood beside his car for a moment before getting in. The city lights reflected across the glass, fractured and shifting, mirroring something quieter happening beneath the surface. For once, he didn't reach for his phone, didn't fill the silence. He just stood there, thinking, not about the deal, not about the meeting, but about something simpler, more precise. He had been wrong. Not about the numbers, not about the strategy, but about something far more fundamental, where value comes from. He exhaled slowly, then opened the car door and stepped inside. The engine started. The world moved. But something had changed. Not externally, internally. And that difference would carry forward. The next morning, the meeting began exactly on time. The room was filled with investors, executives, and expectations. Everything structured, controlled, predictable, until it wasn't. Because when Daniel reached the point where the discrepancy would normally have been managed quietly, he stopped and addressed it directly. No delay, no deflection, just clarity. He explained the inconsistency, the structure behind it, the adjustment, the implication, before anyone could ask, before the narrative could form outside his control. The room listened, not with suspicion, but with attention. And when questions came, they were measured, contained, because transparency had already done its work. When the meeting ended, there were no disruptions, no fractures, only understanding, and something else, trust. Later, standing alone for a moment, Daniel looked out over the city. Glass, steel, movement, scale, the world he had built, still intact, but now seen differently. And somewhere, between that world and a quiet restaurant table, a truth had settled into place. Not loud, not dramatic, but lasting. Position decides where you stand. Perception decides what you see. And in the end, that difference was everything.